We're going to plunge into chapters 6 through 10 of One Nation Under Blackmail and try to unpack some really disturbing connections.
Yes, some seriously unsettling stuff.
So we're talking about Roy Cohn's alleged role in, intelligence-backed blackmail operations.
That's right.
We're talking about the shadowy connections between the CIA and drug and arms trafficking.
Right, through BCCI.
Through BCCI.
Yeah.
And even accusations about how powerful figures like J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles.
Well, actually, the book mentions Dulles initially in this context.
Okay.
Helms comes in a little bit later.
All right. So Dulles and Helms allegedly protected pedophile rings that were connected to elites.
Yeah, it paints a picture of a deeply interwoven network operating in the shadows, potentially influencing the very fabric of our society. And we're going to try to trace the alleged tendrils of these clandestine operations as they reached into Wall Street, the White House, even major media outlets.
So our mission here
is to understand the alleged mechanics and the sheer scope of these networks.
Right.
Always keeping in mind
that
we are working with the information presented in the source material.
Right. So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Chapter 6, A Private CIA.
Right.
Just the title.
Sets the tone.
Sets the tone right off the bat.
Yeah.
So it describes this shift during the Watergate era, suggesting that Kissinger's policies kind of contributed to the rise of this robust, semi-covert network.
Yeah. So what's the core idea here for you with this whole private CIA concept?
Well, it seems like it's talking about powerful individuals and groups that are operating outside the, direct control and oversight of official intelligence agencies.
Yeah, but still working in concert with them in a lot of cases.
In concert with them, right?
Yeah.
So we're seeing this emergence of new right activist groups and think tanks.
Right, and you've got groups like the Conservative Caucus, the Free Congress Foundation, that are named.
And our alleged connections to intelligence networks are pretty deep.
It really suggests a blurring of lines between political activism and covert operations.
And the book even gives us the specific address, 7777 Leesburg Pike, which is tied to Richard Viguery's direct mail operation.
Yeah.
Now, this wasn't just about, fundraising or political messaging.
Right.
There was potentially an intelligence component at play here.
It seems that there was concern within certain circles about the direction of the CIA under Admiral Turner.
Yeah.
And that this created an environment for this whole private CIA concept to emerge.
Right.
And this involved individuals like Ted Shackley, who felt that the agency was being compromised or weakened.
Yeah.
So you're essentially seeing a parallel intelligence structure developing,
right,
driven by its own agenda and potentially less accountable.
Or less accountable.
Traditional oversight.
Wow. And Shackley's name comes up a lot in these discussions.
Yeah, he does.
The chapter details his post-CIA activities and claims that he built his own intelligence network.
Allegedly with financial backing from Edwin Wilson.
Right. And then we also see companies mentioned like International Research and Trade or IRT and API distributors.
Yeah.
And even foreshadowing a connection to the Iran-Contra affair down the line.
What's fascinating to consider here is how Shackley's post-CIA endeavors are portrayed.
Yeah.
It's not just private business dealings.
Okay.
These are integral nodes within this octopus-like network, as the chapter describes it.
Wow.
And this included entities like Global International Airways,
right,
which is alleged to have been involved in illicit activities, arms, and drug smuggling.
And they name names.
They name people like Pete Bruton and a figure called Bobby Ross.
Right. So this is really painting a picture of a shadow world where the lines between, legitimate commerce, intelligence operations, and even criminal activity become so blurred.
It gets really murky.
It does.
And then they start talking about the financial architecture supporting this alleged network. Yeah. And they introduce Herman Beebe and his purported network of banks and savings and loans.
And he's a significant player in facilitating financial crime connected to the CIA.
Allegedly.
And there's even mention of links to the East Coast Mafia.
Yeah.
So this is really scary stuff.
It's getting into some really dark territory.
Yeah, and then the chapter transitions into this section called Bush's Web.
Right.
It focuses on George H.W. Bush's long association with the CIA.
Even before he became its director.
Right, and they highlight his role as president of the Gulf and Caribbean Foundation.
Yeah. What should the listener make of this?
Well, the implication is that Bush's involvement both acknowledged and potentially covert roles, provided the central point of connection for all of these burgeoning networks.
This is a central figure.
Yeah, and the Gulf and Caribbean Foundation is suggested to be more than just some philanthropic endeavor.
Right.
And then we learn about the Misher Corporation and its alleged CIA links, including G.H.W. Bush's partnership.
Right, and they connected to Allied bank shares and even Pennzoil.
So it seems like there are some deep financial interests that are intertwined with intelligence operations at a very high level.
Yeah, that's the picture that's being painted.
And then we get the Safari Club.
Oh, yeah.
Which is described as a shadowy covert apparatus
Right.
involving intelligence agencies from France, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt.
So you've got this international element.
And what's really crazy is that BCCI is allegedly backing the Bank of Credit and Commerce International.
With BCCI figures even on its directorate.
And Adnan Khashoggi's involved.
Of course.
So this highlights the international scope and the financial muscle behind these private intelligence initiatives.
Huge amounts of money being moved around.
Yeah, BCCI is starting to look like a really pivotal element in these clandestine activities.
Yeah, for sure.
And the Safari Club operating outside formal government oversight really embodies this idea of private intelligence with a lot of resources.
Yeah, they've got the money and the connections to do whatever they want.
Wow, so then we get the World Commerce Corporation.
The WCC.
Right.
With its own alleged intelligence connections and commercial activities.
So this web just keeps growing.
It just keeps expanding.
And then Robert Vesco pops up.
Oh, yeah.
A name synonymous with, financial dealings and scandals.
Right.
And the chapter links him to these private CIA networks, specifically mentioning his involvement in the iOS scandal.
Yeah.
And even alleged connections to Nixon's campaign.
What's the significance of this for you?
Well, it seems like individuals with questionable financial backgrounds were being utilized by or aligned with these networks.
Right.
Maybe because of their ability to move and conceal large sums of money.
Outside of traditional scrutiny.
Right. And this leads into a discussion about multiponics.
Yeah, another entity with alleged intelligence connections, and Vesco was directly involved.
Right. And then the chapter dives into William Casey's early career, highlighting his connections to the Board of Economic Warfare and later the OSS during World War II.
So this is going way back.
Going way back. And the author suggests that Casey's involvement in intelligence circles continued long after he left government service.
Yeah, laying the groundwork for his later role as CIA director.
So this establishes this long-term connection to the intelligence world for a figure who would later be at the helm of the agency.
Right, a crucial piece of context.
And then they revisit Robert Vesco, referring to him as the Detroit Kid.
Yeah.
And they reiterate his financial manipulations and alleged connections to organized crime and intelligence figures.
So Chapter 6 really builds this foundation of this powerful, interconnected, and largely unaccountable network.
Right.
Operating beneath the surface.
Utilizing both established and unconventional players.
A lot of moving pieces.
Yeah. Then we move into Chapter 7, a killer enterprise.
Right.
And they immediately introduce BCCI as an outlaw bank with origins tied to Pakistani intelligence.
From its early days, BCCI was involved in some serious illicit activities.
Nuclear proliferation.
Intelligence operations.
So for you, this sets the stage for a financial institution at the very heart of global malfeasance.
What's striking is this alleged dual nature of BCCI.
Yeah.
On the surface, you have this rapidly expanding international bank.
Right.
But underneath, it was deeply engaged in facilitating illegal activities globally.
And Aga Hassan Abedi, the bank's founder, he's a central figure in all of this.
And the bank's unusual organizational structure and rapid growth are highlighted as ways to conceal these operations.
From regulators and law enforcement.
Right.
And the accusations against BCCI are heavy.
Money laundering, arms trafficking, drug smuggling.
Wow.
It was a central clearinghouse for illicit financial flows.
And the connections to prominent intelligence figures go even deeper.
They do.
Richard Helms,
a former director of the CIA, is mentioned as having ties to BCCI and even serving on its board of directors.
So this raises questions about potential oversight failures.
Right, and even possible complicity at the highest levels of intelligence.
Wow, and then there's Burt Lance, who had close ties to President Carter.
Right.
And his involvement with Financial General Bank Shares, or FGB.
Yeah.
And its subsequent takeover by BCCI is discussed.
It seems like this was a strategic move by BCCI to establish a stronger foothold within the American banking sector.
Right.
And then you have the formation of First American Bank Shares and its alleged connections to BCCI through figures like Clark Clifford and Robert Altman.
So this alleged infiltration is becoming even more clear.
It's a complex web of connections.
And the chapter names other key individuals within BCCI, like Gokul and Rappaport.
Right.
And they link them directly to these alleged illicit activities.
Reinforcing this image of a bank that is deeply compromised.
Operating outside the bounds of legitimate finance.
Right.
And then we start talking about the structure of the enterprise.
Yeah, focusing on Richard Secord and Albert Hakim's network of companies known as STTGI, which were instrumental in facilitating arms dealing during the Iran-Contra affair.
And Manuker Ghorbanifar.
Right.
He plays a key role as an intermediary in these transactions.
Yeah, he's a key figure.
So the connections between this outlaw bank, BCCI, and the mechanics of covert operations like Iran-Contra are becoming very clear.
It's all starting to come together.
And then they introduce IDEA.
The Institute for Democracy, Education, and Assistance.
Right.
And it's suggested that it served as a conduit for funding and support for this enterprise.
So IDEA appears to be a seemingly legitimate organization that was used to channel funds and provide logistical support for covert activities.
Right, further obscuring the true nature of these operations.
Right.
And then the narrative shifts to Singlaub and his company Geomilitech, outlining their alleged involvement in clandestine operations in Nicaragua.
And connections to individuals like Paul Helwell and E. Howard Hunt.
Oh, and here's where Roy Cohn reemerges.
Roy.
Tying back to our initial points, the chapter mentions his alleged advisory role to the Western Goals Foundation.
So this suggests that Cohn's influence might have extended beyond just legal and political circles into the realm of intelligence operations.
That's a critical connection to note.
Yeah.
Cohn's appears to be a recurring figure across multiple facets of these alleged clandestine activities.
And then they talk about the alleged use of Geomilitech Consultants Corporation, or GMT, for arms dealing, and its reported connections to Israel.
Yeah, expanding that web of international connections.
Right, and the financial threads continue to weave together with Edmund Safra's Republic National Bank.
Right.
And its alleged connections to BCCI and money laundering.
Underscoring the potential role of established financial institutions in these murky dealings.
Yeah, and finally, Chapter 7 delves into the mainland savings connection.
Right. And
the alleged role of Adnan Khashoggi in facilitating financial transactions involving BCCI and figures associated with organized crime like Mario Renda.
So you've got intelligence operations, seemingly legitimate financial institutions, and organized crime all intertwined.
It's a scary picture.
It's a very complex and troubling web.
It is.
So then we move into Chapter 8, Clinton-Contra.
Clinton-Contra.
And the focus shifts to the alleged activities of the enterprise in Arkansas.
Right.
And the narrative centers on Barry Seal's reported drug smuggling operation.
Yeah.
And its alleged connections to the Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport.
Bringing these alleged covert activities to American soil.
Right, on U.S. soil.
And what's crucial here are the allegations that Bill Clinton, who was governor of Arkansas at the time, and other prominent figures in Arkansas were either directly involved in or aware of these illegal activities.
Happening right under their noses.
Yeah.
And the crash of Seal's plane and the subsequent investigations brought these allegations into the public eye.
Right.
And then they explored the alleged connections between various Arkansas banks and savings and loans.
Right, or S&Ls.
And money laundering activities linked to the Contra operations.
So it seems that the financial trails of these covert activities might have run through seemingly ordinary financial institutions.
Yeah, hiding in plain sight.
And Herman Bibe pops up again.
He does.
With allegations of his ties to both intelligence operations and organized crime networks in Arkansas.
Reinforcing that theme of interconnectedness that we've been seeing.
And then they introduce Jackson Stevens and his influential firm Stevens, Inc., highlighting their deep political connections within Arkansas and their alleged involvement in the state's financial and political landscape.
A powerful nexus of influence.
Yeah, and the formation of the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, or ADFA, is also discussed with allegations suggesting it might have played a role in facilitating questionable financial activities.
Potentially linked to the Contra operations.
Raising questions about the potential misuse of state-level financial institutions. And finally, Chapter 8 details the alleged involvement of offshore reinsurance companies,
specifically Coral,
in laundering money linked to Contra operations.
So that offshore element further complicates the financial trail.
Right. It makes it very difficult to trace these illicit funds.
All right, so then we move into Chapter 9. High-tech treason.
High-tech treason.
And the focus shifts to Robert Maxwell.
The media mogul.
Right. With
his alleged deep ties to both Israeli intelligence and the Mossad and the Soviet KGB.
This introduces a whole new dimension of international espionage.
Yeah, and potential manipulation of information on a grand scale.
They discuss Maxwell's acquisition of Pergamon Press,
Right,
with the implication that his vast publishing empire might have been a cover for intelligence activities.
giving him access to information and influence across the globe.
Yeah.
And then the core of this chapter is the Promise software scandal.
Right.
The book outlines the software's origins, its capabilities, and the alleged theft of this software by Israeli intelligence.
With the assistance of individuals like Earl Bryan.
So this highlights the potential for technological vulnerabilities to be exploited by intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
And the implications of the theft and manipulation of Promise are really far-reaching.
The chapter suggests that this software, once compromised, was used for widespread espionage and even blackmail by intelligence agencies worldwide, raising huge questions about global privacy and national security.
They even mention Yitzhak Shamir in this context.
Yeah.
And then the book brings in Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon's book, The Spy and the Businessman,
Right.
which focuses on Maxwell's alleged intelligence activities.
Adding more weight to these claims.
And then they explore the alleged connections between Maxwell, the compromised Promise software, and the Iran-Contra affair, suggesting a potential link between this high-tech espionage and the arms for hostages scandal.
So you're starting to see this interconnected web of clandestine operations.
Yeah.
And then they bring in E-Systems.
Right, a major defense contractor.
With allegations of their involvement in the Promise scandal.
And their own connections to Israeli intelligence.
It's a complex and potentially compromised network of relationships.
And then there's Stanley Mann.
Yeah.
And his alleged role in financing the development and exploitation of Promise.
Along with his connections to Tony Rowland and his company Lonro.
Adding another layer of financial intrigue to this story.
Right. And finally, Chapter 9 circles back to Danny Casolaro.
Yeah.
And his investigation into the Promise software.
Right. And this overarching network he called the Octopus.
Foreshadowing the events of the next chapter and his own mysterious death.
Right. So then we get to Chapter 10, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Yeah. And this chapter focuses entirely on Danny Casolaro's tragic investigation.
He was really trying to uncover the truth behind this vast interconnected network he believed was the Octopus.
And this chapter personalizes the dangers of uncovering this kind of information.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game.
The chapter highlights the key individuals that Casolaro was investigating.
People like Robert Booth Nichols, Michael Reconocido,
and the Cabazon Indian Reservation.
These were central nodes in the Octopus network that he was trying to expose.
And then they talk about the connections between the compromised Promise software, the Inslaw case,
the legal battle over the stolen software,
and numerous high-level government officials.
This formed the core of Casolaro's investigation.
And the potential role of Israeli intelligence agencies in the Promise affair and their motives are explored.
Adding an international dimension to this whole thing.
Right. And then the chapter turns to the suspicious circumstances surrounding Casolaro's death.
Right.
Raising questions about whether his investigation got too close to the truth.
And whether foul play was involved.
Right. The unresolved questions about his death cast a shadow over this whole narrative.
A very dark shadow.
Yeah. And the reported connections between the individuals Casolaro was investigating and figures involved in the Iran-Contra affair and other clandestine activities are reiterated.
Yeah.
Underscoring the interconnectedness of these alleged events and this vast network Casolaro was trying to unravel.
Chapter 10 really leaves you to consider the implications of this interconnectedness.
Right.
And the serious questions it raises about hidden power structures.
And the potential for abuse.
Exactly.
So as we conclude this deep dive into One Nation Under Blackmail, let's summarize the core connections that the author presents.
Right.
We've examined Roy Cohn's alleged role in trafficking blackmail material.
Yeah.
The links between the CIA and drug and arms smuggling through BCCI.
Right.
And the accusations about figures like J. Edgar Hoover and Alan Dulles and later Helms shielding pedophile rings with connections to elites.
And what's really important to note is how the book traces the reach of these networks into Wall Street, the White House, and media empires.
Right.
It suggests a pervasive and deeply entrenched system of clandestine activity and influence.
And it's important to remember that we're exploring the information as it's presented in One Nation Under Blackmail.
Right. We're just looking at the book here,
No.
not making any judgments.
So this leaves us with a final thought.
Right.
What would the implications be if even a small fraction of these allegations were true?
Yeah.
What would it suggest about the hidden levers of power operating in our world?
Right. And the challenges in uncovering this kind of information.
Yeah. What questions does this raise for you about intelligence agencies, financial institutions, and the abuse of power?
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
It really is.
It really encourages us to critically examine the forces that shape our world.
For sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
All right, well, that's it for this deep dive.
Nope.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.